In my mind, I wholeheartedly believe that there are a position for each image in your portfolio to make you money. But it goes without saying that some images are much more profitable than others. Today, I want to talk about what images are potentially more profitable than others, what images you should make, and why. So I'm going to put up a few images on the screen here. We'll go ahead and scroll through some images. This is a picture of some sunflower seeds with a transparent background of what we can see here. There's other images that are related to sunflower seeds. You can go ahead and see here that I have the AI generation selection submitted through our filtration process here. We can go ahead and look at some other things like the inclusion topic. This is one of the topics that I wanted to kind of point to and kind of compare it to something as casual as sunflower seeds. And when I say casual, what I'm really aiming at is the concept of the evergreen versus the trend. In our current society today, there are certain topics of conversation that lead to higher demands in the stock photography world. For example, a picture of sunflower seeds, if you compared the amount of demand, not even the picture, but the demand itself, the search volume, to something like an inclusion type image, if we just simply compared the niche, inclusion would have much, much more demand than something like a sunflower seed. Now, I want to be clear. In the beginning of this video, I made a promise. I said that I would talk about what images to create and why. So just because one image creates more money than another doesn't necessarily mean that you should completely negate a specific niche. Why is that the case? Well, if we know that, niche A can potentially make more money than niche B, shouldn't we just focus all on niche A? The answer is no. At a certain point in time, niches have these upswings in attention, and they also have these die-downs in attention. In the same notion, there are other niches that really aren't volatile, aka let's use sunflower seeds in this example. Let's put ourselves in a position of somebody who would actually try to download an image like this. Maybe, let's say somebody's creating a sunflower seed brand, and they want to sell these products of sunflower seeds, or maybe they're a graphic designer for a sunflower seed brand. They're going to come to Adobe with their little licensing package. They're going to download some images related to sunflower seeds. They might potentially find this one. They think it's a great solution. They download it, they slap it on their label, and legally they're allowed to use it, right? That's an example of somebody who is involved in this Adobe stock world, buying these images and utilizing them for their own commercial purposes for the reason of, saving time, creativity, things like that. Now, let's go ahead and put ourselves in a position of, inclusion. In this case, diversity, equity, inclusion type of concepts. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion are concepts of, really more in the Western world, honestly, especially in the United States because of the diversity in the world, where it's kind of this political concept of including as many people as possible in an organization, offering certain jobs to people who potentially maybe their demographic might not necessarily get those jobs, things like that. Now, I'm not here to talk about if it's right or wrong. You be the judge of that. That has nothing to do with this video. What I'm really trying to say here is that these concepts are things that are trending currently, especially in the political and governmental climate. You have these concept of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a very polarizing thing to talk about. Very, very polarizing. If a YouTuber can talk about this kind of stuff, he'll essentially create enemies overnight, and he'll create diehard, fans overnight. So for me, I'm not here to share my opinion. What I'm really sharing is the concept that this is of attention. Now, if you, let's just say, create a bunch of images in these niches, you could potentially make some money here and there. There's no negating that that's not a possibility. But what you have to really hope for is the long-term approach of the niche, okay? The long-term growth of that niche. Because what we tend to find is that trends are usually mistaken for fads. And a fad is essentially, imagine a trend but with a much, much shorter lifespan. A trend is usually something that will live on, kind of like the internet trend, right? The internet at one point in time didn't exist, and slowly, through time, it came into existence. It became something that was a trend. People were talking about it, people were focused on it, and it was something of attention. but it was here to stay. It stayed for many, many years, and even till today we're using the internet, right? But a fad is something that is much more short-lived. For example, let's use George Floyd, for example, right? The concept of talking about George Floyd took a very short period of time. Many people would call that, a trend, or his name was trending at a certain point in time. But if we really break things down into semantics, it's really a fad because it died off. The conversation died off. But the concepts of a trend like the internet never really died off. It became something that was ever present. The point here is that there are many people who live in stock photography contributor land, let's just say, who focus on making as much money as possible, which is inherently a problematic point of view, because what you do is you start to focus on things like this that are trends, but over time these trends die in demand. The concept of diversity, equity, inclusion was highly demanded just 2 years ago. It was something that was spoken about pretty much every day, and every single company had to adhere, in America, had to adhere to certain, I guess you can say, ethical concepts, or constructs, rather. Make of you will when I say the word constructs, but constructs, rather, right? However, not every single company focuses on that today. That's not really one of the main focuses. In fact, I was talking to, here in New York City, I was talking to a boss, a guy who owns his own business. He has a marketing agency, actually. And he says that there are these people that come into his company from the United States government checking on to see, because of the certain amount of revenue that he produces a year, if he's truly adhering to diversity, equity, and inclusion type of requirements. People of certain color, people of certain demographics have to be working in his location, and he has to be essentially fulfilling these requirements. Now, once again, I'm not here to say if it's right or wrong. It's none of my business. I'm just simply sharing the facts around the business of Adobe Stock. When you want to create one image over another, think of its commercial use, think of its long-term use. And of course, like I said, every image has a place in in your portfolio. Some images, mentally, that they're here for a trend, and some images are more for the long haul. An image like this, like these images of sunflower seeds created, I would really think of them as an evergreen type image, an image that has demand throughout time. Just as many people are searching, sunflower seeds now, they're probably still going to be searching pictures of them into the future. Of course, negating the fact that there's AI and things like that, assuming that people had essentially, the need for an image like this doesn't necessarily die down simply because of the niche that it lives in. Does that make sense? And this goes for many evergreen concepts. Images of food, images of people, images of clothing, images of buildings, images of cars, images of, you name it, products, equipment, utilities, you name it. Certain niches just simply don't die down. And then here, like I said, you have niches that are much more volatile. They have such a strong amount of demand, but over time, that demand is short-lived. It could live for a year, it could live for 2, it could live for even 3 or 4 or 5, but it won't last forever. It won't always have that demand purpose. So this is an example of, again, another keyword, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We have inclusion here. Tariffs. Tariffs are another concept of trend. Let's face it, 6 years ago, or maybe not 6 years ago because of the elections, but let's say 2.5 years ago, there wasn't many conversations around tariffs. In fact, at the time, the word tariffs was probably an evergreen niche because, it has these natural swings of up and down, but they truly weren't volatile. But now, because of the government discussing the tariffs, it's something that's going on that really had a crazy amount of conversation around it. And when there is a lot of conversation around certain concepts, guys, typically the demand goes up immediately during that period of time. You have to think of press releases. You have to think of articles, blogs, videos that are looking for content that they can commercialize that is essentially stock, something that they can use for their businesses and legally allowed to use. So, yes, tariffs has now, the concept of it has converted itself, essentially a hybrid from a normalized concept, like I said 2.5 years ago, to something now that everybody speaks about pretty much on a daily basis, the word tariffs. Now, this is a perfect example of a hybrid, okay? The reason why I say that is because at one point in time, tariffs was not discussed. It wasn't something that really it needed discussion in order for it to have some sort of demand, because let's face it, 2.5 years ago, the concept of a tariff existed. Didn't exist to the level that it is now in terms of discussion, but it still existed in real time. And because of that, right, there was a certain level of demand. Now, let's just use, for the sake of argument and the sake of conversation, the amount of units of demand was at an 11, for example. If 2.5 years ago it was at 11, today we're at 1,000, because it's much, much more spoken on. I mean, that's all it is. And when things are spoken on, media needs to acquire content so that they can utilize it in their revenue streams, creating the content, creating the videos, creating the press releases, etc. So I wanted to lay this out to kind of tell you or show you a mental representation of what images to create, what images not to create. And if you've truly understood the concept of this video, I'm not really telling you not to create anything, but I'm really telling you, when you do create something, understand why you're creating it and what you're creating it for. It's not about do this or do that. It's about understanding why you're doing something. And if you could truly understand why you're doing something, well, then you're learning how to play chess and not checkers. You're not taking instruction, but you're creating instruction. A critical difference between the two. So I hope this video makes it very abundantly clear to people as to why it's important to think about what you're creating and why you're creating it. And whatever the purpose that makes sense and that you rationalize in your mind, go ahead and create more of that. And over time, the more and more and more that you create, it will allow you to increase that amount of drip feed income that you're going to be producing over time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was kind of a food for thought type video, psychological thought, if you will. Once again, I hope you guys enjoy it. If you have comments, questions, concerns, or anything you want to share, leave them in the comments down below. I'll also leave a link in the description to the Superstock AI course. You can go ahead and check it out. It's my personal guide to all the information that I learned when creating stock photography type images here on the internet. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you guys for watching. Peace out. Bye.